All right, Ken and I believe we can finish our Matthew 24 series today in this episode, mostly because a big chunk of scriptures in this next passages, we've already done a couple of videos on it. Before we realized we were going to do this full Matthew 24, we started hitting some of the high points that people like to ask about. So, but with that said, let's start in verse 23 because we've gone through verses 1 through 24 or through 22 already. So Ken, verse 23, then if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. What does he mean?
Yeah, this is something Christ is actually doing a recap. So those of you who have been following our video series here on Matthew 24, this is familiar information. In fact, he says this let's look back. He says in verse number 5, even in 4, Jesus answered. It's actually the first thing he said to them when they asked when the temple was going to be destroyed. He says, take heed that no man deceive you. Verse 5, for many shall come in my name saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. So this is actually a message that we read about in historians. I bring in Josephus when it's helpful for us. I don't have a bunch of quotes today, but there's in fact, as you know, Jimmy, I just got his complete work. So I'm at home having fun going through Josephus right now. Josephus was a really interesting guy. He was a first century Jewish historian who was actually captured by the Romans. And he was actually a prisoner of war, and he was probably on his way to die. But he's a really quick talking guy, and he told them, hey, I'm valuable. I can write things down, don't kill me. So the Romans said, okay, fine. You start documenting everything. So he wasn't a follower of Christ. He was a Jew by nature, but he actually really championed the Romans to stay alive, really. And he started writing things down and actually later became a great source for us. But he has a lot of interesting documentation on the fact that a lot of people during this time period between Acts chapter 1, the ascension of Christ in about AD 30, and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, those 40 years that basically the book of Acts covers, those 40 years, there were actually a lot of people that would come and say, hey, I'm the Messiah. And there's a lot of documentation of that. We looked at some of that when we already went over those verses. But here Jesus is reiterating to them in verse 23, if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. Now, why? Let's go ahead and talk about this just real quickly. If this was hypothetically talking about our future, as most people today teach this, and by the way, let me say, most people in the West, in the East, people don't talk that way and take this as future. That's a phenomenon that's fairly recent, as of the mid 1800s in the West, as dispensationalism grew, and that is a tenet. We say futurism, but whether you think it's a pre-trib rapture, pre-wrath rapture, all of that is basically, that's the same argument. If you're coming out of dispensationalism saying, I'm not a dispensationalist, I'm pre-wrath, you have the exact same belief as them. You're just moving it about 3.5, 4 years later for the rapture. It's the same system, though. So I think it's funny when people want to champion themselves and say they're not dispensationalists because now they're pre-wrath rapture. Well, you have the exact same system of a future 7-year tribulation period. You're just simply moving the rapture about 4 years. With the exact same system in place. They still see the 70th week of Daniel as future to us. It's not that different. Anyway, I always am amazed by that. But anyway, in the West, somewhat recently, you have this phenomenon of dispensationalism. So why would Jesus say, if somebody says, here is Christ, don't believe him? If this is our future he's talking about hypothetically, he should say, look for me. When you hear of me, believe it. It's me. I'm coming back. But Jesus is very, very all-inclusive, saying it won't be me. It won't be me. Now, how can he be so sure? Well, I thought what would be good for us in this video, because I do think this video will be a little shorter than the other ones, even though there's more material. And I thought it would be good for us to do a timeline.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah. Sometimes I tell our church that, and they're like, so we're going to get through this verse today. Well, it hasn't happened yet, so we'll see. But let's go ahead and look at a timeline. Because I have had a lot of people also say, hey, if what you're saying is true, then where does that leave us exactly? Where are we at in this? And I thought maybe we could answer some of those questions. So let's go ahead and do a bit of an overview. So I always like to just kind of put the cross as a reference point. So you have the cross here, and let's kind of move forward. So Jesus dies and is buried, and he ascends in Acts chapter 1. And in Acts chapter 1, he ascends into heaven. And this is, if you want to read along with what's happening here, this is from Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14 specifically, it tell us that when he goes to the Ancient of Days, if he's going to the Father, that means he's going up, not down. So this is not a reference to the rapture. It's a reference to the ascension. He's going to the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man receives, at that point, he receives a kingdom that has no end. He receives the nations for his inheritance. He's stealing them back from Satan. Satan has been essentially the king of the world up until this point. He had dominion, is the more biblical language. And Jesus takes that back from Satan. Up until this point, Satan has had dominion. In fact, we'll go back even a little bit further than that. Adam had dominion. The Bible teaches us in Genesis, I believe it's verse 26, you can read it. It talks about him having dominion of the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and so forth. But he forfeits that dominion, and he forfeits it when Satan gets down on one knee in the garden and says, will you be mine? Basically, you want to follow me and not God. And they say, I do. So Satan then is given dominion of the kingdoms or the nations. Interestingly, the word nations in the Old Testament, if there's an S and it's nations, that's the word Gentiles in the Old Testament, in Hebrew. And so there's a distinction between nations and nation. That's Israel. So you have, of all these nations, you have one nation that is the priestly nation. It's the go-between nation between holy God, sinful man. But Satan took the nations as his own. That's why he was able to offer the kingdoms of the world to the temptation, Matthew 4, to Christ. You ever wonder about that? Say, all these kingdoms can be yours. Jesus didn't say, what are you talking about? They're not yours to offer. No, it was a legitimate offer because Satan was in charge of the kingdoms up to this point. Jesus stole them back. So one of the things people have asked us, Jimmy, is how do you guys know the difference between second coming lingo and AD 70 lingo? Well, one of the ways you can know this, because I had that question too, and I was trying to figure this all out. One of the ways you can know that is by the terminology of he comes as a thief in the night. When Jesus comes as a thief in the night, he's stealing something. In his second coming, he's not stealing anything. He's coming as a thief, and I know that's a simile, but it's using that simile because he's taking something. And Jesus is taking the nations back from Satan, and they're given in Acts 1. So you can read about that in Daniel 7. So our timeline here is the death, burial, and resurrection 40 days later, the ascension of Christ in Acts 1. And that's going to kick off. This is, by the way, we're just going to say this is in AD 30. In AD 34, Stephen is stoned. And we go to then, we're going to put a 4-year period on here to, I don't want to make this too complicated, but we'll just go to then Acts chapter 8, verse 1. The reason I'm doing that is because that will then be approximately AD 34. And that's the death of Stephen is in Acts chapter 7. And that will complete our, going back this way, that will complete our 490-year prophecy of Daniel's 70th week. So the 70th week is completed in AD 34. So we'll just say 70 times 7. I have had a couple people ask me, so maybe this is a good time to say this. I'm trying to get all the loose ends together because of the content may be a little easier in this video. I've had some people ask me, where are you getting the years from if it says weeks? Very simply in the Hebrew, the way it's worded, and it says 70 weeks are determined, that word week just means a unit of sevens. It could be a unit of 7. In our case, we usually use the word week as a unit of 7 days. But the unit of 7 here is 7 years. And so it's 70 units of 7 years, which is 490 years. So we already did that in a past video, so I'm not going to spend time on that. So then the gospel goes to the whole world, in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, and Jerusalem is no longer the focus because this prophecy is completed. Remember, it said, upon thy people. Then we see the gospel begin to flourish, and that brings us to AD 66 to AD 70 is what we would call the Great Tribulation. And that ends in AD 70. And this ends with the Roman Jewish war. And it's ended in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. So really the book of Acts is going from AD 30 all the way to AD 70 approximately. It ends just before we read about the destruction, but things are getting really, really bad. It probably ends in 65, 66, 67 in the book of Acts. Then after that, we have what's left. People say, well, where does this leave us? Well, where it leaves us is that all the way from Adam to the cross of Christ, let's not lose the cross in all of this. We have the cross of our Lord here, all the way from Adam to the cross of Christ. You have a time of increased wickedness and death. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. Death and wickedness increased until the cross, to the point where when Jesus was born, it says in Isaiah 53 that he was born like as a root out of a dry ground. That doesn't make sense, root out of a dry ground. Jesus was like a welcomed refreshment in a world that was the darkest it could possibly be. Morals were at the lowest, whatever you want to say, all over the world when Jesus was born. And so death increased, and that's why the Bible talks about leading up until the destruction of this how do we want to say this? The Judaic age or temple age system. That's why they warned in Acts, it's going to get worse and worse before this thing comes to an end. Things are waxing worse and worse, and men are not listening to sound doctrine. These are all of the warnings leading up to the destruction of this old religion. But from the cross, a little tiny seedling of hope, Jesus was born. And this little tiny seedling of hope starts very, very small. Jesus, as one person, is taking on the establishment. Jesus is taking on the nations, the rulers, and the kingdoms of the world. This is Daniel chapter 2. This little tiny pebble, this rock made without hands, Daniel 2, is made without hands. The Bible says it goes over and it strikes the image on the foot. The image is the successive kingdoms. Remember, the head of Babylon and so forth, Medes, Persians, Grecians, Romans. And it's kind of like Jesus gave that statue a hairline fracture on one of its toes. Remember, the toes, the foundation of the image, was the weakest. It was a mixture of iron and clay. There was weak points at the foundational parts of Rome. And Jesus gave this metaphorically a hairline fracture. Doesn't seem like much. It's like the giant stubbed his toe. But man, that hairline fracture and these fault lines found its way through the giant of the nations, and he toppled the whole system over as Christianity took over the Roman Empire. And there's never been a world empire since then. And this little tiny stone in Daniel chapter 2 begins to grow. And it says it grows until it becomes a great mountain and takes over the whole earth. So just as we see death increasing under the fallen, sinful wickedness of Adam forfeiting the nations to Satan, and so we see Satan's empire going and getting stronger and stronger, just like we see that, we also see Jesus, the last Adam. As the last Adam, we see Jesus essentially starting a new creation over again. So creation has started over again in Jesus, the last Adam, and we see him now spreading something else. It's not going to be death, but it's going to be life everlasting. It's going to be, instead of wickedness, it will now be righteousness. And so life and righteousness are growing as the gospel grows and as the kingdom of Christ grows. This is why we said in our Psalm 110 study that things are going to trend towards better and better. We're not saying By the way, maybe another good opportunity to clarify. I thought of an illustration that may help people. When we say things are getting better and better, I think what people are thinking is they're saying, go look at the worst morality on the planet. Man, I can't believe, they think that's better. Look at the worst thing we can imagine now. Look at, political upheaval and war, and now this terrible shooting in Russia we saw, and abortion, and these things are awful. How could they say things are getting better? Let me clarify. And I think this is a really good illustration. This is the best illustration I've come up with. Hopefully I can come up with a better one. But imagine a large, let's just say, imagine a swimming pool, a body of water, a swimming pool that you can see in your backyard or something. We all know oil and water don't mix. So say that there's a substance in the water that you can differentiate between water and that. So let's just say oil. What we're saying when we say things are getting better is what we're saying is at the cross of Christ, the ratio of righteousness to ungodliness was very, very small. There's a very small percentage of the world that was in covenant with God. What we're saying is, when we say things are getting better, is we're saying there's a larger percentage of righteousness today than there was. Let me give an illustration. Let's just say water is righteousness and oil is unrighteousness, for the sake of our illustration. And let's say you go out to this body of water and you see at the cross, it's almost all oil, and you just see a couple drops of water. Now, the water is water and the oil is oil. Those aren't changing. We're just talking about ratio. What we're saying is today, the water, the life-giving water of the gospel has grown, and there is oil still in the pool. It's just there's a higher percentage today of water than there is of oil. And I think what people are doing, Jimmy, is they're looking at the quality of the oil today, and they're looking at it saying, this oil still looks filthy, dirty, rotten, disgusting, wicked. And we're like, yeah, it's ungodly. It's unrighteous. We're not saying unrighteousness today looks more righteous than unrighteousness used to look like. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the percentage of godliness today is greater than it used to be at the cross. And it's up to us as followers of Christ to minister to those that are possibly going to be able to convert to Christianity. And through that process, in time, righteousness will increase and things will get better because the percentage of saved people is better. So please don't examine unrighteousness today in all of its wickedness and tell me you're wrong because unrighteousness is disgusting today. I know it is. Of course it is. The oil today is the same quality as the oil, with our illustration, as it was in the first century. Disgusting today, disgusting in the first century. What we're saying is percentages are shifting slowly in time because Daniel 2 says the little stone becomes a mighty mountain. It's a process. So hopefully, I don't know if it's a great illustration or not, Jimmy, but hopefully people can understand.
How does oil and water mix? Does oil stay on top? As you were saying that, I'm thinking, okay, as more and more water comes, it's pushing the oil to the top,
Yeah,
where it's really, really visible. We're seeing all this stuff right now, maybe because righteousness is putting it on display so much, and we're becoming so aware of all this wickedness and evil, and it seems like it's everywhere. But
it is on full presentation today.
yeah,
Yep.
And maybe that, using your analogy, the more righteous people are saying no, and they're exposing all this oil, all this
Sure.
unrighteousness.
And I think the point of the reason I tried to find an illustration where the two elements stayed the same was because I think people were misunderstanding us, saying that we think morality across the board is getting better. Sort of, in a sense, because more people are saved, more people are followers of the Lord Jesus today than there were in the first century. So we should have influence on society. The more Christians there are, the less we should see of it being acceptable to beat your child. Christians should make it to where it's not socially acceptable to rob someone. Our moral and our ethics should have an effect on our society. And we do see that, where if you're going to be a corrupt politician, which we all know happens all the time, way too common, but you do have to hide it. You do have to run as a good guy. You do have to trick people. That's the point. It's not socially acceptable like it was in Nero's days. Nero openly skinned children and wore their skin as their clothes in front of their moms. And you know what the people did that were next to Nero? Applauded it. They laughed because they were on his good side, and their conscience was totally seared. It was not, Nero could not run in a political campaign. Not that he wasn't looking for votes, but Nero wouldn't run a political campaign on being a good guy. He would just say, how about this? I kill you if I want to kill you. How about that? He didn't care what anybody thought. Whereas today, even the most corrupt politician, I'm thinking of Justin Trudeau in Canada. I think the guy is wicked. He's destroying the freedom in Canada. And, he has a smile, his hair is done. He's like, I care about Canadians. I'm putting you first. I care about you so much. I want to control you, Canadians. It's like with a smile, he's taking all their freedoms away. He has to get them to believe that he's on their side. So we see even in the most vile cases today, we won't look at Putin or even Kim Jong-il, an extreme case politically. They still want to present themselves as good people. We're not buying it, but I'm just saying they have to present themselves as good family people. The people in North Korea, they get blocked news. Do you know they all believe that Kim Jong-un's, is it Il or Un? Il's the older one, right? Un is the current. They believe Kim Jong-un played his first round of golf and beat every record that's ever been. That he went out one day, and they have this with everything, that he went out his first time bowling and got a 300. They say, and they all believe it because they don't allow internet from outside. Wow. So even in this ungodly bubble of North Korea, he presents himself as an amazing good guy. In other words, he doesn't present himself as wicked. That doesn't fly anymore. So but I don't want to rabbit trail too far. But we don't believe morality across the board is getting better, as in the ungodly are better today than they used to be. No, wickedness today is the same as wickedness in the first century. And when you pull out of the pool in the illustration and find a cup of oil and you go, you guys are wrong because look how dirty this oil is. It's just as dirty as the first century. Therefore, you're wrong. We know that. The point is the ratio is shifting. That's why our Psalm 110 study says that things are getting better. It's getting better because there's more righteousness today than there was. But don't use an example of a wickedness and say, see, this wickedness is just as bad as that. We know that. So this is a very important shift from the gospel, that through Christ and through the obedience, Matthew 28, Great Commission, things are going to trend towards good. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us in a post AD 70 world in the new covenant where righteousness is going, and we live somewhere right here, somewhere between AD 70 and the second coming. And we believe with the template that we're teaching that things will just continue to trend this way. And one day the Lord will return, I believe, in his second coming. And this will be a physical coming where he will resurrect the dead. Those of us who are alive and remain will be caught up together with him. And he will resurrect the dead and will forever be with him. The Bible refers to this day right here. It calls this the last day. And that's when the last enemy is destroyed. The enemy is death. This is 1 Corinthians 15. And then it even says at that point, the kingdom is delivered up to the Father. It doesn't say the kingdom begins this day. Read 1 Corinthians 15. It says that day that the kingdom is delivered up to the Father, meaning it's not starting, but it's completed. Not completed like Jesus isn't reigning, but the growth up to that time period, that time period is completed. So people have been asking about a time of where does this leave us? Hopefully that may give maybe more questions than answers, but at least get us down the road here. So it brings us to this point. Jesus is saying, so why does Jesus so emphatically say, if people say, let's read it again, verse 23, if people shall say to you, lo, here's Christ, believe it not, or there, believe it not. How could he emphatically say that? Well, let's look at this and think about it. He's talking about the time period between his ascension and the destruction of the temple. How can he say, if someone says there's Christ, don't believe them, they're wrong? He says it emphatically. Why? Let's just think about it. Look at the chart for a second. How can he say that?
Could it be because he understood all of the prophecy regarding him and his return in judgment, and it wasn't a physical return at that point? It's just a guess.
No, you're right. Absolutely. The answer is just what you said. The answer is because Jesus knew where he was going to be. Where did he go in Acts chapter 1? Well, the Bible says that he was taken up into heaven. At the ascension of Christ, he sat at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Jesus knew where he was going to be. That's why he could emphatically say, if you hear about my coming, that's not it. Now, I don't want to confuse anybody, but let's hypothetically switch this around and say this is talking about the second coming. Why would he ever say, speaking of his second coming, if you hear of me coming, it's not me? Why would he ever? He would say, look for me, I'm coming. Make sure it's me. You won't miss me because, I'm powerful and I'm not some bozo. But here he says, if you hear of it, it's not me. How did he know that? Because very simple. He's in heaven. He's in heaven, and he knows that the destruction of the temple is within 40 years. And he knows where he's going to be at that point, and it's not going to be on earth. That's why he knows that. He says, if you hear about it, it's not me. Let's look on.
If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and check out the full episode by clicking the link below.